Grace and peace to you from God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. I don't know if you noticed, but our gospel this week has made biblical commentators uncomfortable for many years. A despised outsider, the Canaanite woman, challenges the religious order and begs for a few crumbs of bread, a few crumbs of grace from Jesus. Now the disciples, the insiders, urge Jesus to send her away, just like they did the crowds of sick and hungry people. Today we find that Jesus has a very strange dialogue with this woman that can have some very serious and significant implications. So what in the world was that gospel all about? Well, it's always useful to look at the context. This story is sandwiched between two feeding stories, one of the 5,000 and one of the 4,000. And immediately preceding the entrance of this Canaanite woman on the scene, as we just heard, Jesus was telling his disciples, teaching them about what really makes you clean or unclean. What defiles a person is not what they put in their body, but what comes out of their mouth from their heart. So a look at this bigger picture should give us a clue that something important is happening here, something that has to do with feeding and ministry. But is it about faith alone? Is it about inclusion and exclusion? Is it about grace? Is it about healing and wholeness? Is it about persistence? Is it about speaking your truth, even if your voice shakes? In a word, yes. The point of this story is about all of these things. We are all, in a sense, the Canaanite woman. You might not like hearing that, but that's the truth. And we come here today begging for crumbs of grace. And I wonder truly if we know what it feels like to be an outsider, to be one of those looking in, or to even be someone who is not invited to the table. Because more often than not, we think of ourselves as insiders. Like the disciples, we try to follow Jesus. We know the rules and the traditions and how things work and are comfortable. We know this familiar context here. We are sometimes annoyed when our orderly traditions and ways of doing things get disrupted or interrupted. How many young parents, for example, have gotten a sideways glance and felt like outsiders when their noisy toddler made too much noise for our liking? How many visitors have been confused by our worship because they can't juggle all those books? How many people are confused by our insider language? Think about it. A senior warden? Are you guys running a prison around here? A parish house? Where is that? Is it up the street? And who lives there? You get my drift. We have insider language. And as I read and wrestled with this gospel this week, two unsettling questions seem to emerge. The first question is, can Jesus learn? I know that may sound odd, but on the one hand, we may quickly answer, well, of course he can learn, until we start to worry about the implications of that answer. Does that mean that he wasn't perfect? Does that mean that he wasn't somehow complete? Or that he struggled to understand what God wanted him to do? I ask this first question because at the heart of this very challenging gospel and even somewhat of a disturbing passage is the reality: did the Canaanite woman pass a test, or did she persuade the Lord to see things in a different way? Now, if we go with the former, which is the most popular interpretation, she somehow passed a faith test. And Jesus didn't really mean what he said. You know, about ministering only to the Israelites, the Jews, and of course about calling her a dog. All of this was just a test. It was a way to bring the harvest of God to the fore. A harvest that had already been planted in her. A platform to speak and reveal her truth. That's probably the more traditional read on this story. And I think we like that interpretation because it makes Jesus seem a little less harsh. We kind of understand that he was setting her up to then praise her. But the other possibility is that Jesus' own sense of the kingdom, of what he was even about, is challenged by this woman. It is stretched by his encounter with her, a fierce and bold woman. Maybe that is, Jesus believed that he was only sent to the Israelites. And this woman takes that on. In fact, she persuades him that there is something larger at stake here. It makes sense for Matthew's community that was primarily Jewish. And they were struggling with, what do we do with these Gentiles? You know, what do we do with them? And she was a them, a despised Canaanite woman. In this context, Jesus' proclamation of the woman's great faith has nothing to do with her being extremely pious, good at devotions. It's simply the fact that she holds on in this moment. She won't let Jesus go until he blesses her, and more importantly, her daughter. Because you know what? Moms with sick kids are like that. They won't let anything get in the way of taking care of their child. And if we take this direction, this interpretation, then we see that Jesus can in fact learn, and he does. He learns that God's kingdom and his mission is bigger than he or the community around him had imagined. And I think that that invites us to realize that our vision of our mission and God's purpose unfolds in our life in bigger ways than we can imagine. This tenacious and faithful woman, a complete stranger, an outsider, pushed Jesus to reconsider, to learn, and to grow. All of which brings me to a second question. Can we learn? I ask this because of the conversations that I've had this week with many well-intentioned people who are deeply concerned about our world and even about our congregation. How do we get young people to come? How do we welcome and nourish new people? It's no secret that most churches are getting older and smaller. And so many people in those churches are wondering, what happened? What went wrong? And rather than answer that question directly as if I have the answer, I think about this. Have you asked the people that you wish to come to church why they don't? Because somebody mentioned that Friday at lunch. Have we dared to have that uncomfortable conversation? And are we ready to listen to their answers without getting defensive or judgmental? And the answer is usually no. I don't want to be uncomfortable, and I don't want to make them uncomfortable, which is understandable. Because the way that we have always done things seems to work well for us. It's worked for generations. What's wrong with those folks? What's wrong with them? But taking a cue from Jesus' encounter with this woman, we might do well to wonder how our words and how our actions can help people to connect their spiritual lives to their daily life challenges. Which means that if we want to learn, or as Jesus emphasizes, to understand, we first have to listen. And once we've listened, we need to be open to changing how we nurture congregational life in a way that's not only loyal to the bunch of us regulars, but to the folks who aren't coming, those who used to come, those who might come. Because if you think about it, we have a lot of people right here who live on our periphery. You know what I mean? They show up now, every now and then. Why is that? Because here's a thought. This woman that Jesus meets, entangles with, and then learns from, she's a person. She's a person with all kinds of needs and cares and passions and troubles and interests. And the great faith that she demonstrates is that she will not allow herself to be dismissed. Too many people are used to being dismissed, especially by church, overlooked and critiqued by us. They assume, sometimes based on experience, that church isn't really interested in them as people, but only as skilled laborers or giving units. And so many who are hurt, who are tired, who carry weary burdens, they don't have the energy that this woman had to keep on. They simply leave us disappointed and disenchanted. I feel like I say this often, but I think it bears repeating. There are people sitting next to you right now who are battling a great darkness. They are battling significant challenges of which you will likely not know anything of. You may hear bits and pieces, which make you think that you understand. But to understand, we, you, me, have to be vulnerable and courageous. We have to be willing to hear what comes out of our mouths and that of others. We have to be convicted by very hard truths. We have to be willing to walk through the darkness of valleys of death that are all around us, and to lay down our lives for this gospel and for this people that we say that we love so much. Can we do that? Can we bear to be interrupted by God, by a child, by a visitor, by a stranger, by a friend in need, by a hurting and very broken world? It's my hope and prayer that we would be bold and unrelenting as we seek a way of understanding and compassion and determined action as the very people who are called to be God's hands and feet in this world. And the people of God said,